Good morning. Boker Tov. Good morning, Professor.
Good morning.
It's a pleasure to be drinking white wine at 10 a.m. with you.
I know. I haven't started sipping yet. Let's see what happens, you know, when yes.
It's an honor to have you. A lot of people here know your work, and it is a privilege to have you here. And we'll just put everybody on the same ground. 20 years ago, you published a groundbreaking research. You identified cities, a new class of cities that are emerging thanks to technology and a new flow of capital. You call these cities global cities that are linked among themselves, and they have started to take a new role in the world economy. Tell us about this and how Tel Aviv fits into this thesis that you introduced 20 years ago.
All right. Well, first let me say it's just a great pleasure to be here. I always love Tel Aviv, and it is really just a great place. So, to the global city. When globalization begins, this phase of globalization, people are really just paying attention to this notion of space-time compression, communication capabilities, the notion that firms could go anywhere because of connectivity. And so it kept, for me, there kept being this blank. As it, you know, and the question that I had was, do all these global actors, global flows ever hit the ground? Do they need a territorial moment? And that is how I began to look at this question of the global city. Now, I had a hard time doing the research for this. I had to invent mixes of data. It was not an easy task. And in the end, I wound up with something that, if I want shorthand, I call a global production function. And the global production function, production here goes both from material to non-material. You know, finance also has a production, is part of a production function. So it seems to me that this global production function, in that part of it that takes place in the city, has a massive impact on that city. Secondly, very important, and it always goes beneath the radar screen, there's a very strong tendency. Am I talking too long? Do you have a lot of questions?
Many questions.
Because I'm gone. Anyhow, but the second point that sort of goes beneath the radar screen is the fact of the specialized differences of cities. People tend to think that globalization homogenizes. It does. It homogenizes consumer markets. And very importantly, it tends to homogenize a visual order of the state-of-the-art area within a city. But the question really is how that built environment gets used, how that city gets used. So I've had a very hard time persuading people, actually, that what matters in the global economy, besides the homogenized consumer markets and such, are the specialized differences of cities. So I like very much when the mayor of this city, that is you, right? Hi there. Emphasized a particular feature of Tel Aviv, which is a startup. That is how we need to think about cities in the global economy. So I always like to say, when look at China, and just looking at finance, in other words, one sector. Finance has 4 major financial centers: Hong Kong, Shanghai, Beijing, and Shenzhen. They are very different. Even if they need the same infrastructure, the same types of buildings, certain types of expertise, they are different. Chicago and New York, the leading financial centers in the United States, very different. So when Boeing, just to give an example, when Boeing, the manufacturer of planes, factory in Seattle, decides to enter the global knowledge economy, Boeing did not even consider New York as a location. They knew that they could leave their factory in Seattle, but they had to sort of set up a headquarter in a major global city. It went to Chicago. Why? Because the specialized financing, the specialized lawyering, the specialized accounting, et cetera, in Chicago, they know how to deal with big manufacturing, with logistics, etc. whereas New York doesn't know that. So that is, I think, how we need to look. You are dying to ask me a question.
You're talking about very good things. This is all very positive.
No, you have to interrupt me.
I have to interrupt,
and
of
the
course.
clock is ticking. My God, yes. All right.
You have portrayed a picture of cities, if I understood correctly, specializing in certain economic forces they have, leading globally. The barriers between countries matter less. It's what these cities do to reinforce their status as the leaders, global leaders in a certain sector.
You just added a couple of sentences to what I said, but you know what? That's okay. That's okay.
That's the good side. There are bad sides to being a global city, possibly.
Thank you.
And we here in the city have an agency that is leading our process to become a more global city. But there are things we have to look at because the process has many, many aspects. And you've seen this also in the past 20 years among cities that you call global cities.
Right. That's right.
Talk a bit about that.
Well, I think one of the there are two major issues, really. And that has to do, when I talked about this need for a territorial moment, well, what does that really mean? That means a huge urban footprint on the part of these globally involved firms, which and that territorial moment is just one moment of a trajectory that has many non-territorial aspects. But by God, when those sectors hit the ground, they become material. They need buildings, they have people that want fancy houses and fancy restaurants. So the irony in this global digitized era, where the most globalized sectors are often very, very digitized as well, when it has that territorial moment, it has a huge need for urban space. What does that do? We call that gentrification when we give it a certain name. It expels lots of people, little firms, modest middle classes out of their life space, the life space they may have had, for a while. So that is a brutal encounter. It doesn't look brutal because usually it means an upgrading, beautiful architecture, well, not always so beautiful, but you know what I mean. So you have a sense of, my God, the city's doing much better. Well, in the shadows of that newly built environment lie histories really of expulsion, of people, of enterprises, and of certain types of, so that is one of the issues, I would say. Not unrelated to that is growing inequality. I mean, I think the United States is probably in the lead. A city like New York has extreme inequality. So I don't know if Tel Aviv, I remember vaguely you had a certain type of event here, huh? People saying it was too expensive to live in Tel Aviv, right. I mean, this is really a serious issue. And here comes an element that partly explains this. I think that one of the features of the global city, back to the production function, is that it produces a kind of knowledge capital that I think of as urban knowledge capital. The city is a critical space for the production of that type of knowledge capital. And it really is, if you want, that knowledge capital is more than the sum of all the brilliant, whatever, experts, financiers, lawyers, etc., in the city. And it is more than the knowledge that can be produced by all the firms. So there is a real multiplier effect. And you can only have that in this complex setting that is a city. Now, mind you, again, the need for that type of knowledge capital is just one little element, in a much larger knowledge field, some of which is pretty standardized. But that means that any actor who's global in the economy, because there's also culture, that's a different story, needs a footprint, that urban footprint, which then creates this growing demand for space in the city, for a certain type of shopping mall and a certain type of hotel, et cetera, and keeps pushing people out. So part of the dynamism of the global city brings with it logics of expulsion, and that's really serious stuff.
Over the past years, people have always asked you about cities that you have identified as emerging. You said, look here, look there. What are the cities that should be looked at today, and where is Tel Aviv? Are we one of those cities that people are talking about now more than 20 years ago and paying attention to, and in what way?
Yes. How's that? No, really, Tel Aviv has, I think that the work that has been put into this city is quite remarkable. And
if you need more time, we can add 5 more minutes if you want. We're flexible today, yes.
I think that, but what I also like is a focus. You can't just aspire to be, the imperial capital of an older age. No, there is no imperial capital. You know, when you look at the rankings, no London, no New York, no whatever has the top score. It's all sort of muddling in the middle, huh? And in a very narrow range. And I think that Tel Aviv has done right is the startup and nightlife. How's that? No, every time I've come here to give a terribly serious lecture at the university, we always end up in some little restaurant. Very often I grew up in Buenos Aires, so they take me to a serious meat cooking and eating. And it just goes wild. Maybe it's the Latin Americans in Tel Aviv. I don't know that. But it definitely, it's just a great city. You have done something. It's also very international. You know, I have so many people who are permanent residents come from other countries, so that makes a lot of difference. But I think that the startup clearly is a very significant part of, you know, I am not an expert on Tel Aviv, so I will not say, you can ask me, I'll give you sort of, but, you know.
What about other cities?
Other cities what? In
What
Israel?
should we look at? No, other cities around the world. In Israel, around the world?
Other cities coming. Well, here's my take, that the global city has a fourth aspect to it. I'm sure you all remember the first three. We won't run a test. The fourth is that when a global firm, an investor, wants to enter a thick national economy, it actually needs a bit of a bridge. And that bridge is often a city that then emerges as a global city. The global city is a kind of frontier space. And what I mean by a frontier space is that you have encounters between actors that belong to different worlds for whom there are no established rules for that encounter. And that also happens, I would say, at the level of poor people, like immigrants, etc., that things happen in that encounter. And so as the global economy globalized, especially in the 90s, and it continues to do so actually, you have a growing number of these cities. So now we are like almost up to 100 or so. China has several. But you see these cities that emerge, but what it is they're not the Londons and the New Yorks. They're very specialized. Their advantage resides in particular features. So everybody's speaking now, Luanda is not a global city, by the way, Angola, but it has really changed. There is enormous amount of inequality, and it has to do with it being a kind of bridge between that new wealth, that is oil, etc., that has been now circulating at high prices. And so, you know, so I think that those are cities that have global city functions. You have a lot of that. They're not quite fully global cities. And there I would say that Tel Aviv is much closer to a global city rather than a city that has, like Luanda, that has one particular set of things that make it, you know, a global little foothold, but still there is a difference.
Our project is bringing more international students and more business and more tourism. Where is our biggest competition? Which is the city that's most
Tel Aviv?
for Tel Aviv?
Well, I would, if I were doing the research, the way I start my research, I would first want to know within its leading sectors, what are the circuits on which Tel Aviv is situated, like in the startup business, and there must be a few other things, you know, where you are strong. And that depends how detailed you want to do the research. That can mean hundreds of circuits. A city like New York is located on thousands of specialized circuits. The more specialized you make it, the more insights you will gain, though at some point you have to re-aggregate. So in the case of Tel Aviv, my first move would be, let me check out what are the multiple circuits within the startup business. I'm sure that it's not all startups in all sectors. It's a certain kind of set of sectors. What's happening, you know, around the edges of those sectors where you're strong? Can you strengthen that? Or should you jump circuits, so to say, and enter a new type of business? Because we see continuously new types of specialized, you know, sectors emerge.
When you go back home to New York and people ask you about Tel Aviv, you'll say Tel Aviv is like what?
That's not a phrase I would use. I would not say that about any city. It's like, you know, they have this differentiation. So what I will say about when I go back,
if you liked being a student you will like Tel Aviv. If you liked taking your vacation here, you would like Tel Aviv. What are
well,
those
then
places?
I think of Tel Aviv as a city that has a really dynamic, live, also a bit of a frontier town, like New York, you know. We are not always very polite, you know, but a sense of, no, I mean that, no, I mean it's kind of energy. So that is what strikes me. It's the mix of worlds, the energy, and a kind of intelligence that wants to make, rather than, I don't know, describe, you know, or... So I always say about London, I love London. But London, you have the most extraordinary things happen, you know, so the most brilliant lawyer. We had a great lawyer who helped us buy our first flat in London. And he was supposedly at top of the business. And so we got into our apartment, and he had overlooked one little thing, a 22-year-old water bill. You know, that's the kind of thing that happens in London. You know, I mean, I have a whole set of stories like that. Can you believe it? Top lawyer, real estate lawyer, whatever we call it, doesn't see 22-year-long bill. I don't think that would happen in Tel Aviv. I have that impression. Mm-hmm. But maybe it happens here too, you tell me. No. But you know, so in New York it wouldn't happen either. You know, there is a kind of a frontier zone spirit. That is sort of what I like.
I see. We have a couple more minutes. I would like to allow the audience, with your permission, to if we'd like to take a few questions. If anybody would like to ask Professor Sassen about her work in Tel Aviv and her research. Anyone? Who wants to be first? Yes.
You mean my standard right now talk on the what's in the shadows of powerful images? And so is that, or you mean, what I said at the edges, you know, what we don't? Okay, right. Yeah. Well, I mean, I just finished a little book where I argue that we cannot simply use the language of more inequality, more poverty. I think what we are seeing is a multiplication of kind of systemic edges. That's not the border, not the interstate border, but systemic edges across which some, as I said before, people, little kinds of enterprises, certain neighborhoods, they're simply expelled, they're thrown out. We see that very sharply in some countries. And I'm thinking of the United States and, you know, Nigeria, whatever, a whole mix of countries. So I think that is one of the critical issues. But you also raise a question that just makes me think about something else I would love to say, which is, so here is the language of Tel Aviv. I'm just thinking aloud now, huh? Mm-hmm. That's okay, no? Thinks itself sort of a leader, considers itself is, you know, but that's also the language, a leader in startups, whatever you have good language for that. So my reaction is immediately, when I emphasize the startup business this much, what am I not seeing about Tel Aviv? You know, and I don't know what the answer is. But that is sort of I was already last evening when the language was emerging, and I think it might be interesting to find out what else. That is how Berlin found out that it was a great cultural center, that you had a lot of digital artists that connected Berlin with London and LA, that parallel circuit, not you know, so I am sure you have that here too. So that is sort of one reaction that I would have, you know, what else? It's also the shadows, but maybe in this case in a positive sense, right? That what is it when we emphasize and overemphasize something, what don't we see that is also happening in the city? And it may well have to do with artists and culture. And now the other question I would have, can I ask you a question?
You can ask me a question. We have 1 minute left. If I can answer it in a minute, I'd be happy to.
Well, on the same line, what are we not seeing when we emphasize the startup? Well, what about certain forms of knowledge that deal with the social, given that social is one language, given that this is always a complex sort of social situation as well, the mix of nationalities, the tensions, the immigrants, etc. And I wonder whether there are, I know quite a few people who are very active in certain networks. You know, there is kind of a form of knowledge, because this is one of the biggest challenges we face throughout the world. It is not so much technology, it's the social question. And I think that your mayor, I regularly hear him bring up the social question, which I think is very important. This has got to be part of the story. And cities are a place where, is it the rubber hits the ground? You know, where things are really acute and not cute, acute. And hence, they become visible. And so it seems to me that would be sort of another aspect that I would, think about.
Your question leads us beautifully into the next panel, which is about a strategy for urban millennials, which will be led by Roy Folkman, who's a policy analyst. Professor, I want to thank you very much for coming to Tel Aviv. It's a pleasure.